I want to start off, I'm sure everybody wants to really hear about the Marikana massacre, and I will talk a lot about that. But let me just begin by trying to situate it in some very general observations, which really are related to the issue of permanent revolution and deflected permanent revolution. And I'm starting here not really because I want a second stab at Neil's argument, but more because it's really impossible to think about South Africa in the last 30 years without using those concepts. They have really made a lot of sense. And also because I found myself having that tricky little word deflection in the title that I presented, so I'll need to explain that. Now really in summary, as I understand the way Trotsky put forward the theory of permanent revolution and the way that we used it in the case of national liberation movements, was to understand that the national question, whether taking the form of independence from colonialism or the form of an end to apartheid in the case of South Africa, that the national question would have to grow over into the social question, into the question of who controls the economy, who has power in the economy, because it couldn't be solved by the bourgeoisie. And the idea of deflected permanent revolution starts from the question that what happens when the force that could solve it through a socialist revolution, in other words, the working class, when that force is either absent or politically weak, that it's not able to fight independently. And that's where Cliff comes in arguing that in that case, we'll have a deflection of that revolution. In other words, that other forces will step into the vacuum and come in with partial solutions, but solutions that can't really last. And when you look at the history of national liberation movements across Africa, the several waves of what happened, what you find is that for a period, and it's a very specific period of capitalism, you have lasting deflection of the issue of permanent revolution through various forms of state capitalism and through kind of a national independent development through that was made possible largely by the fact that the former colonies had become less important to the world economy throughout that period. Now, by the time the ANC comes to power as the last in a long wave of African liberation struggles, my argument would be that that mode of deflection is no longer available. That actually by then these countries have been pulled right back into the world economy, but still often in a inferior position. And therefore what you find with the case of the African National Congress, partly because of this, but also partly because there was a significant and quite serious homegrown working class movement and reasonably independent working class movement, that the mode of deflection moves away from setting up forms of state capitalism to actually a concentration on what I would call forms of containment of the working class movement, where actually it's focused not just on how do they hold on to some form of capitalist development, but actually also focused very largely on deflecting any challenge that is inevitably coming, and we'll see that in the case of South Africa, out of that movement that had built itself up. And I'm thinking aloud when I say this, but my sense of it is that what we're having in South Africa is a very long and protracted unfolding of the contradiction that still remains, so that hasn't been solved by the end of apartheid. But that what we're seeing more and more is an increasing compression of the crises in that contradiction, that the crises keep coming thicker and faster and quicker after each other, and that's actually starting to break down the possibilities for containment and for deflection in a very real sense. Okay, so onto the Marikana massacre. Now, I think the massacre of the miners actually illustrates several things about these general points that I've made. And firstly, I think it exposes, the first point I made, the limits to solving the problems that apartheid created, certainly for the working class, but even for the national bourgeoisie, are really exposed in a very real sense by the fact that the massacre happened at all. And on the one side, you can see this, for example, yesterday I mentioned that South African mining was built on cheap labor, which in turn was built on a form of migrancy. And one of the things that's been exposed by this massacre is that migrancy is still very much alive, even without the formal Bantustan system on which it relied before, but that the mines are still relying on taking people from rural areas of South Africa, taking single men, bringing them to the mines, and then getting them to work very cheaply. And one of the few things that's changed, two things have changed. One is that people did manage to drive up wages since the end of apartheid through a series of strikes soon after the end of apartheid, but also whereas the migrancy system depended on mine-run hostels, what's actually happened now is things have almost gone backwards, that with the end of the hostel system, you're now finding people forced to take responsibility for their own housing, and therefore mine workers who are working all day in 35-degree centigrade heat are going home to sleep in tin shacks just next to the mines with the end of apartheid. So on that side, certainly that illustrates that's just one of many ways in which we can see that for the working class, the problems of apartheid are still, even though apartheid itself is gone, that many of the problems that went with it are still very much alive and well. On the other side, we're seeing, in terms of the government's reaction and the kind of intervention it made, we're seeing that the limits of what that aspirant bourgeoisie was able to achieve in terms of independence from the industry that actually built apartheid. And one of the changes we've seen there is that whereas the mining system was central to funding the apartheid machine, mining is still very important in the South African economy, despite some diversity that it's achieved. But with the difference that it's now, the profits are now largely repatriated to countries outside of South Africa. So Lonmin, for example, is sending all its money back here to London, and therefore this key strategic industry is actually not at all under the control of this national bourgeoisie that aspires to control South Africa, and that you've actually had an extremely narrow transformation of the capitalist class, that really the black bourgeoisie, if you want to call it that, has been allowed to develop largely as the executive arm of the bourgeoisie, as the state executive of it, and even then severely constrained. So it's not that there's been no, as I'm sure people know, it's not that there's been no involvement of black businessmen coming up through into the top industries, but the top industries on the Joburg Stock Exchange are still largely controlled by white. The majority of shareholders remain white. And even the control of the state over the companies that are within its national borders is extremely narrow. It's able to do quite a lot, but there are limits to what it can do, and therefore, with this massacre, what we saw with, I think South Africa is something like 80% of platinum reserves, making it an extremely strategic industry for this national bourgeoisie, that actually it was forced to intervene on behalf of the platinum bosses, whether they wanted to or not, because of the importance of that industry within it. So we've had a really narrow transformation in that sense. Now, I'm not saying that that narrow layer that is in charge of the state is not able to, you know, that it's not acting just as any bourgeoisie would act anywhere, yeah? But certainly it exposes that the depth of transformation, the depth of change and the end to racism has been to the rest of the world and to a lot of black middle class people in South Africa. It exposes that that has been very narrow and that very little has changed of the way the system runs, and therefore it opens up the possibility not only for a cycling through leaders, something a little bit like the political revolutions maybe that Neil was talking about, but also it opens up a possibility for a rebirth of forms of radical nationalism. And where we can see this most clearly is not just in a cycling through presidents, but also with the growing popularity of Julius Malema, who, as you might know, was expelled from the ANC Youth League, apparently for bringing the organization into disrepute and for accused of corruption, which of course the president also stands accused of corruption from the time before he was the president, but actually largely because he was beginning to challenge that the ANC needed to do more about nationalisation and move back to those kinds of questions. Now, this is one of the things that we have seen, is a rebirth of radical nationalisms, and that's one of the things that can seize, I think, the discontent that we're seeing growing on the ground. But of course, the other thing that Marikana shows, that the strike of the miners shows very clearly, and one of the most amazing things about it, for me, is the fact that the strike itself was organised completely outside of any union structure. Okay, and it's been probably 20 years, it was sometime in the 80s, that we last saw anything of that level of self-organisation, with its own strike committee, intensely democratic. When we were trying to do solidarity work with them, everything took forever to organise because they argued about everything. Everything had to be discussed and agreed within the strike committee. And despite the involvement of the African Mine Workers Union, the AMCU, which is an alternative union to the NUM, the very discredited NUM, the AMCU wasn't actually involved in starting the strike. They came in late to the thing. And it was only right towards the end, with the negotiations, that they were able to really begin to play any significant role in the thing. Now, of course, it was exactly this independent organisation that made the strike so dangerous to the platinum bosses, because it meant really that for the first time in a long time, where they'd had the luxury all along of having the NUM more and more involved in productivity deals, more and more the ones who would intervene on their behalf to get people back to work. In the case of the series of wildcat strikes that have been happening, this is actually not at all the first strike that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years of similar groups of workers, but where the NUM was working to contain the strike, to force it back, and to tie it up in some kind of negotiation, and thereby to contain it. And what happened with this strike, because it was outside of all of that, it became very difficult for them to end the strike or to get it even back to the negotiating table. It took, about 4 or 5 weeks before they finally got to sit around a table with people. Now, I think the strike was, it's a fantastic victory on 2 levels, even though, it's a victory still within the limits of what a single strike on its own can achieve. One of which is, not only did they force the management to negotiate direct with them, obviously there's potential long-term problems with organising completely outside of any union, but at this stage they forced the management to negotiate direct with them rather than going through a union and thereby getting easily tied in. They also won, in some cases, up to 22% increase, which is far short of what the original demand was, but is probably an unheard of, I've never heard of a 20% increase in the whole of South African history. Maybe if I go very far back I could find one. But also that it's taken the lid off a whole lot of anger on the mines and sent an example to people there's at least 2 other mines where people are still on strike now, and it's taken the lid off that now the demands are getting even higher, and that people are saying, not only can we fight and win, but we can organise ourselves and win better than what we would if we were organising through the traditional structures. So it's really lifted the lid off in this way. It's obviously, as a result of that, it's caused absolute chaos within COSATU, and this is one of the questions that I'll come back to in a minute that we need to think about, is where are things going with COSATU. But where it's caused, COSATU is the main trade union federation, which is aligned to, has been in an alliance with the ruling party, with the ANC, since 1994. And it's caused an absolute panic for them, because what the message it sends as well is that the trade union bureaucracy is potentially become redundant. And so they've been running around to these other mine strikes, trying to rein them in, trying to get people back to work, or to say, you shouldn't be going off on your own. And then, of course, the third thing it's done, in taking off the lid, it's also exposed that really we do stand on quite a fine balance in South Africa between potentials of a spreading revolt, which we are already beginning to see, and that it's also, I think, crystallized a polarization that has been developing for quite a long time in South Africa, of people becoming less and less sure about whose side the government is on. It really, the massacre has crystallized for a lot of people those questions. So there's a real possibility of a spreading revolt coming from the victory that people have seen. But also it is exposing the very real possibility of a growing repression as the solution that this narrow national bourgeoisie is coming with to the growing discontent with things in the new South Africa. And we've seen this not only that the mines that are still on strike, and in fact even the Marikana mine, in the days after the massacre, continue to be harassed constantly by the police. Jacob Zuma sent the army in, and has given an order that the army may intervene in any case of industrial unrest, as he put it. And has issued an arrest warrant for Julius Malema, who was the only high-profile figure who actually came in consistent with these nationalist politics, and it is a limited nationalist politics, but it was also consistent with these calls for nationalization of the mines. He was the only one who actually appeared in support of the miners, and in doing so, I think, increased their confidence to actually stand up and to continue fighting for longer than they might have otherwise. So we've got this fine balance between the potential of repression and the potential of a spreading movement. Now, I mean, just to put that in perspective as well, this massacre is by far the worst massacre, and certainly in that sense a turning point in the whole history since the end of apartheid. But it certainly isn't the first incident, and it's been part of a growing trend in the last 5 years of a repressive response to protest. Several people have already died, both mainly in delivery protests, but also in at least one strike where protesters or strikers have been shot dead by police. It's more and more a fact of striking that when you go on strike, immediately the police get called in, and it's certainly a fact of any township protest that as soon as you block a road or burn a tire, or these days even gather on the street, that the police appear with tear gas, rubber bullets, and now more and more armed with live ammunition. And I think what this shows very clearly, the fact that there is this growing trend to repression by a so-called democratic government, it shows that these old methods of containment that they've been using since 1994 are falling apart. They're no longer working. And I want to just talk next, before I conclude, I want to just talk a little bit, give a little bit of a periodization to how those methods of containment have unfolded. I mean, just to go back a little bit, I mentioned earlier that the ANC was the last national liberation movement in Africa, and that by the time it came to power, following very, very similarly to the experience of Zimbabwe and even Mozambique, which came late in the day, by the time it came to power, there was already an enormous pressure to conform with the market system, and that all three of those national liberation movements ended up also making serious political compromises under those pressures. So if you look what forced the sides to the table in South Africa for the so-called negotiated miracle in the introduction that Colin wrote, he talks about how the era of revolutions we're in now, one of the things we're seeing is this kind of containment that's achieved through finding reformers in the old order when they're under pressure to reform, but finding also reformists within the movements that are able to contain their membership. Now, obviously the apartheid government was under pressure both from an internal economic crisis and the growing and excessive expense of maintaining the apartheid military machine in order to repress people, and that of course was related to the growth of a mass movement that it was finding increasingly difficult to contain. Now, it didn't repress, you know, and we must remember that the negotiated miracle was initiated partly on a severe repression of that movement in 86, 87, 2 states of emergency, actually pushing things right back but where they could feel very definitely that they weren't able to put the genie completely back in the bottle. That was the pressure they were under. On the other hand, the African National Congress was under pressure by the collapse of the Soviet Union, not only an ideological pressure about whether a different world is still possible, but also very much a practical pressure about where their funding was going to come from to continue the armed struggle. And this really is the background which pushes them into this negotiated settlement. Even so, it certainly wasn't the rainbow miracle, as we know that people have talked about. It was an extremely contested process. It was a managed transition, but also a very bloody process right up until the last, with a number of massacres. The next worst massacre, or next most recent worst massacre, was just before the elections, was the Bisha massacre. And so it was an extremely bloody transition, but which eventually, under the pressure of that mass movement, was forced into some kind of a settlement and forced at least into an election. Now, what we found since then, there have been, roughly speaking, I would divide it into more or less 3 periods of containment, as I'll call it, and its breakdown. The first one being straight after the elections, where we found a period of what I would call militant expectation, where people were expecting things to change and to change fast, thinking it's our government, and therefore were willing to strike and demonstrate for it, but very quickly discovered that actually they weren't necessarily getting everything their way. And that then very quickly turned into, and I'll keep it in the same period, turned into a more passive kind of expectation, where people basically decided, okay, I'm going to get on with life, things have changed, at least, things will begin to change, we'll leave it up to the government. And so you had this turn towards waiting for government policy to sort things out. Within the trade unions, a reliance less and less on striking to get the job done, and more on relying on a new legal framework, and believing that that was enough to now negotiate, and with centralized bargaining, to negotiate wage increases and so on. And very importantly within this, and this was absolutely key to the containment and the demobilization that we saw in that period, was the holding together of the alliance, which is formed from the ruling African National Party, the Stalinist South African Communist Party, and the big addition with the end of apartheid was for COSATU, which is the biggest trade union federation, was for COSATU to become involved in that. And of course the logic that COSATU was using was that the alliance gave them an ear to power, and therefore an influence over the direction of government. The logic that the government was using was, of course, the logic of a leash on the dog, to keep them in check, that they wouldn't get too militant. And really for this first period, which lasts up until the mid-2000s, it's really a long story of growing tensions within that alliance, bursting out and getting pulled back into place, with COSATU playing the key role in keeping people in line and keeping people quiet, and not beginning to speak out too loudly against the direction things were taking. And that, of course, is also the period of the height of Mbekiism, where Mbeki's government drives through essentially a homegrown neoliberal program that abandons even the very limited kind of social welfarist program that had been proposed by the end of the elections. The second sort of period, and this is the one that I think is at the center of the title that I gave this talk, you see actually a paradox developing, that actually the containment, or the ability to contain the growing discontent with how little has changed, the containment begins to break down both from without and within at the same time. And the paradox is that it actually breaks down exactly because people are tied into this loyalty to the government, and into this loyalty through COSATU to the government, that actually that very expectation is also what then begins to allow the lid to come off for the first time as the pressure is building. And it comes out first with delivery protests by ANC supporters as the local government elections come up and people are reminded of the promises. They go on the streets to say, okay, we want these things now. We want the toilets we were promised. We want the electricity and the water and so on. But very much within a framework of saying this is still our party. But something's going wrong and we need to fight. And so actually the first challenge to the passivity actually comes in the form of a challenge to Mbeki. Now it's quite a complicated process how it unfolds and so on. But one of the things within it is also the fact that the trade union bureaucracy is becoming more and more embarrassed by the fact that they've been selling to their membership for all these 10 years, the fact that we're going to get change through the alliance and nothing is really changing. And therefore, actually, you have a growing discontent on the ground, especially expressed through the delivery protest, but also expressed within the unions, starts to mesh with the growing discontent of the union leaders who are feeling isolated and marginalized, more and more marginalized, and made to look more and more foolish by Mbeki just, snubbing them and never actually giving into anything that they say. And so you get the first phase of this leads to a resurgence of struggle. Delivery protests from 2005 and then a rising tide of strikes from 2006 reaching the highest levels ever possibly until now. I think the 2010, first the 2007 public sector strike brings it up to a record high, and then again in 2010. So you get the return of the strike to the agenda, to the repertoire of what people are able to do, and the return of protest after a very long time of quiet with only a very few, the organizations, the so-called social movements, but still a minority that had been taking those kinds of things. So you get a widespread popularity of those things growing again. Now the initial response to that, however, is to simply cycle through leaders. Let's get a new leader for the ANC. And that's certainly still one of the possibilities that's on the agenda now. I'll come back to that in a minute. But where you get very quickly, in the space of 2 or 3 years, Mbeki pushed out of the party completely, and Zuma brought in as his replacement with a renewed expectation, okay, which also reflects in, firstly, a bit of a retreat of mass action again, a retreat of people using strikes and so on, but followed also then again by a form of militant expectation of people thinking, we've now changed Mbeki, there's nothing more to stand in the way, so we expect Zuma to be delivering the wage increases, the water and so on, and if he doesn't, people being very angry and getting straight back onto the street. Now, of course, there is a very real possibility for this to just go on, cycling through different leaders, replace Zuma now with Kgalema Motlanthe or someone else, but of course, the second time can't happen quite the same way. And so, whereas we found it took 10, 11 years for Mbeki to reach the levels of popularity where anybody would even criticize him openly, Zuma was under critique from day one, from his very first term of office. He and his new government actually were immediately plunged into running around, as they called it, putting out fires, both in delivery protests and in strikes. And the level of demand on them, the level of expectation on them, I can't say that it was higher, but it was certainly much more vocal, much more quickly than what it was for Mbeki. Now, of course, there is one of the things that's going alongside this is that the national bourgeoisie, if I may call them that, have been trying to use these changes of leadership also to drive through new solutions to the capitalist crisis, right? So they used the end of Mbekiism to also try and argue for a slightly more interventionist state in the interests of capital, okay? Not a welfare state by any means, not really about sorting out the problem for the working class, but under cover of that to try and get through a new program to sort out the problem that capital isn't as stable as they would like it to be. And that, of course, has happened, and in that sense, you can maybe see the possibility of a series of political revolts, if you want to call it that, a series of political revolutions, just continuing to deflect the problem further. But of course, with the Marikana massacre, we're now into a third phase, and I can't say I'm exactly sure what this phase is going to be. I'll try and outline a few points about it, if I can find my notes. 5 minutes, cool. But the key thing about this phase is that it really has, I think the first key thing is that it has driven home once more a lesson that's long been forgotten about self-organization. You know, the lessons of the mid-80s in South Africa of people actually being forced to organize themselves, whether they did it under the banner of the ANC or the United Democratic Front, but where there was no other option except to organize yourself. And I think this is really what's been decisively reintroduced in this period. Now, in one sense, the miners, you know, I said earlier that they've won a fantastic victory on several levels. And it's a victory not just for themselves, but also a victory by example that I'm sure will spread far and wide in South Africa. It's not just miners that are on strike at the moment, by the way, but there's also small strikes of teachers in the north of South Africa, and some other sectors have been, strikes have been ticking over. But that it's also added this message that we can do it ourselves. As I said earlier, that it's crystallized a polarization that's been developing for a long time. So it does really open up new opportunities. But in one sense, the miners perhaps aren't even aware of what it is that they've really done. In that broader sense, you know, for them, they feel that they've won a massive increase and it's now time to go back to work. But in a very real sense, are perhaps unaware of the broader implications of it. Now, where are things going to go? I mentioned already there's a crisis in COSATU, and that is going to be key. How does that unfold? At this stage, it looks like largely COSATU has retreated into a defensive posture in defense of the National Union of Mine Workers, which has been absolutely horrific on the issue of the massacre. It's basically just dismissed the miners completely. And at this stage, it looks like it's just going to retreat into that lager, but if you look a bit under the surface, there's important divisions that we have yet to see how they will play out. And one of these is the Metal Workers Union, which was the only one of COSATU unions that came with a very clear and a very class-conscious, if I can put it that way, statement about the massacre. That so situated it within an analysis of the accumulation path of capital. So this is a key question, is what is going to happen within the trade union movement. Obviously that is going to be influenced, and I think this is quite important for that future. The fact that there is beginning to be a large independent movement outside is going to make it, I think, potentially much easier for those kinds of divisions to develop in the months that we see ahead and to come to the surface. And this can take many forms. We've seen not only Malema calling for economic liberation, but also the AMCU, the alternate trade union in the miners' strike, is taking a very similar but perhaps more far-reaching position of saying economic liberation, but also at the same time as they're saying join the winning union or the union that will stand with you, they're also sending a message that we have to do it for ourselves, we have to organize from below. And I think that's a key and particularly explosive combination of something that's developing outside the mainstream combined with the divisions within the mainstream. But I suppose the final point really comes back to the point that the political question remains key. All of this can develop, and it could potentially still get channeled back into just sliding back into the old thing of union negotiations. We need a new union, a different union, and we get back into some kind of centralized bargaining formation. It opens up a possibility, but of course that is going to depend very centrally on what the political arguments are that are coming into this movement, and more broadly in society, depending on making political arguments around the calls, such as Malema is putting forward for economic liberation, to start linking those to a perspective of workers' power. So.